Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the American Academy of Diplomacy's virtual interview series. I'm your host, Conor McCarty. The purpose of this interview series is to share the professional experiences of Academy members with students and the general public in hopes of supporting the Academy's mission of strengthening appreciation and understanding of U.S. foreign policy. If you haven't already, please follow the American Academy of Diplomacy across all our social media platforms for the latest U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy updates. Today, we are joined by Academy member Ambassador Robert Cekuta. Ambassador Cekuta is a career Foreign Service officer and former ambassador. He has previously served in numerous senior level positions, including the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Resources, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy, Sanctions, and Commodities, and most recently, the Ambassador to Azerbaijan from 2015 to 2018. Throughout his tenure at the State Department, Ambassador Cekuta has received 9 Senior Foreign Service Performance Awards. He is a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, the Thunderbird School of Global Management, and the National War College. And with that introduction, I would like to welcome Ambassador Cekuta. Thank you so much for speaking with the Academy today.
Thanks, Connor. I'm really glad to be here and glad to be doing this.
Of course, and we're so happy that you could join us this morning. I was hoping to structure the interview today around some of your senior positions throughout your extensive career. But to start, I just wanted to first ask, what sparked your interest in diplomacy and what led to your work at the State Department?
Well, I started off, basically I wanted to be a history teacher. I grew up in upstate New York and I was really fascinated by history. And this may sound kind of hokey, but what happened was my history class sort of became the basis for the Model UN group in our city. And so I went to the Model UN at Georgetown. We represented the Maldive Islands, which we all in those age had researched. This year, the Foreign Minister of the Maldives is going to be the president of the UN General Assembly, so they've come a long way. But it was suddenly realized, in all seriousness, that diplomacy is something that people did. It wasn't something that you just read about, but it was something that normal people did. It wasn't just Count so-and-so meeting with the Emperor of blank. And so I got interested in it and thought, well, it's something I want to do rather than just studying history and teaching it, maybe be involved in it. So maybe that sounds a little grand, but that was really the motivation.
Yeah, thank you. And I actually became interested in through Model UN and attended the same conference at Georgetown as well.
There's a lot of people who, actually I worked on when I was at Georgetown, was one of the people who actually organized and ran it. So yeah, there's a long line of us.
Right. And beginning your career with the State Department, did you have any regional or topical interests that you wanted to incorporate in your career if possible?
I did. I entered the State Department having majored in Central European diplomatic history when I was at Georgetown. And that was what I thought I was going to do and what I was really interested in. When I entered the State Department, I was first offered a job in Washington, and I turned that down because I had spent 4 years at Georgetown. It was closely related to what I'd been doing in graduate school. I thought, I want to do something different. Then I was given a choice between going to either Tokyo or Sana'a, Yemen. And I chose Sana'a. And the reasons for that were that I was going to be the first economic officer, full-time economic officer at the embassy in those days. It was something I didn't really know much about. And I was going to be given some Arabic training. I was not going to be given any Japanese language training. Also, it was sort of a chance to be in a place I didn't know about. I did initially have some thoughts, God, I really wish I were going to Germany or Austria. But as one of the people pointed out to me at Post, you're always going to be able to go to some countries as a tourist. You're not going to have that opportunity to go to other places. And Yemen was one of them. And this was back in the late 70s, early 80s. Yemen was a very different place than it is today. I'm very sad, frankly, about the way Yemen is today. But traveled around a lot, saw it. And then also realized that a lot of the things I had studied, even though they were in a Central European context, could be applied to other contexts as well. And one of the great things about when you study history, what you're really studying is analysis and communication, analyzing what goes on in the country and communicating it and communicating your thoughts about it orally and in writing. And that's a lot of what you do as a diplomat. So a lot of my friends were like, you're turning down Tokyo. I did eventually end up as economic minister in Tokyo. So that I sort of got my wish. It just took about 30 years to get there. But it was a chance to see something I never would have seen any other way.
Right.
And I think that's one of the great things about the Foreign Service is that you have responsibilities, but you also have an entree that very few other people have. And you'll see things that very few other people have. You'll meet people that other people may never have a chance to meet and be able to do things that other people can't do. So it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's definitely great to hear. And I think a lot of students that are interested in the Foreign Service would be glad to hear that insight as well. And I was hoping now to move on to your time as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Sanctions and Commodities. And to start, I was just wondering, in what ways is Foreign Service work in Washington different from Foreign Service work overseas?
Yeah, that's a really important question because a lot of times people think the Foreign Service work is really just being in an embassy. But what you're doing as an American diplomat is you are representing the United States and you are advocating for the United States. Your job is to help advance US foreign policy interests. And so you need the Washington experience, even though people will say, oh, I don't want to be in Washington, but you need that experience to understand Washington, to understand US foreign policy, and to understand how it's being formulated. Because a lot of times you may get, a great, set of instructions, but a lot of times the world is moving 24/7. And it isn't necessarily going to be waiting for instructions from Washington. And it takes a while to get things drafted. So when you have that Washington experience, you get a sense of what is actually on a policymaker's minds. You also get a sense of why you might not get the instructions you want or why you may get the instructions you get. And you're able to provide the backstory to a foreign government. And that's really important because they're in the same boat. They're representing their government. They're pushing their government's interests. And they're trying to understand us just as we're trying to understand them. And so everybody, I think, sort of works out a different balance over the course of their career. I think I've spent probably about 2/3 of my time overseas, and I was very happy about that. But I know that there are officers who will try very hard to not be in Washington. And I think it disadvantages themselves because then they don't have the ability to sort of really know what's going on and know that backstory or be able to kind of guess where things might be gonna go. At the same time, you need the overseas experience because that's really, and that's important in Washington because when you're in the interagency meeting, you may be the only person in the room who's ever been to country blank. And people may have great opinions that they've picked up from some reading and the analysts and so forth, but it's that feeling that you get on the ground, the German, the Spitzengefühl, that is really essential. And so you're able to tell people in Washington, okay, this is what we want to do. If we go this way, we've got a good chance of getting what we want done. If we go this way, it ain't going to work. And so you're bringing, that's the one thing I think we State Department sort of forget that they actually have. That experience of being overseas coming into the Washington policymaking environment really helps the US make better policy and make it able to sort of carry those policies out. So you need both. It's the same sort of skill sets, analysis, communication, substantive knowledge, and frankly, also being able to learn real fast. And also realize I'm learning fast, but I don't know certain things, so don't jump to that conclusion. But those skill sets are important on both sides. And something that you then find when you've worked in Washington, you go back out, is why Washington will or will not necessarily pay attention to a country, or what are the issues that people in Washington will or will not pay attention to. One thing I'd also just add, this sort of changed over the course of my career, because it's my first assignment. I started in Yemen in 1979, but with the internet and with IT that we have today, you have pretty much constant communication. Downside is Washington has a whole bunch of different agencies, and when you're talking to person X, they're one person in a whole wider group, and so you don't necessarily get things across. So you do need to still use the traditional methods, which we still call cables, even though they're not cables, formal messages. But you need, if you've been in Washington and you go back overseas, you have a better understanding of why Washington's doing what it's doing, why the U.S. is going where it is, and you can be a more effective diplomat. So you need both.
Mm. Thank you so much. Yeah, that insight I think is really important and also very interesting as well. And in your time in this position and given your expertise, what do you see as the relationship between international energy and international security?
Closely related. No, seriously. I mean, one of the things which I sort of realized I was an economic officer in the State Department, and what I came to realize is that it is through economics that foreign policy directly affects individuals. If you think about this for a bit, you can have, be a great great U.S. Netherlands agreement on blank, but it may not really affect people. On the other hand, Royal Dutch Shell, a company headquartered in the Netherlands, when you go buy gas, you're directly involved, and through IT, through textiles, through all sorts of different ways, through economics, through buying, selling, jobs, travel. You're involved in foreign policy, and so foreign policy is directly affecting you. So I think that was one thing that was really really comes into this question of national security. And national security is also built on a number of different components. So energy security, which is I define as the predictable, assured access to energy at an affordable price. If we can break all of that down, we probably don't have time for that today. But put it this way, you want to be able to turn on the lights and cook your food. Oh, and driving your car probably a good, nice idea too. Or at least you don't take the bus. If you can't get those things, your life is affected, your economy is affected, your well-being is affected. And governments recognize this, and there are governments who have used this, have taken energy and used it as a weapon, or threatened to use it as a weapon to intimidate other countries. For the United States, remembering the days of oil shortages, and that was something which I've spent much of my life worrying about. Now the world's changed, but it's still this question of the United States. We can physically produce all the oil and gas we need, for example, but if the rest of the world were shut off, there were major disruption, our prices would go up at the pump here. People would not be able to afford the natural gas or the heating in their houses. So it is intimately connected. It is the energy security is something that directly, again, affects people's lives. It can be something where you have a vector through which your country can be attacked. It's a vector through which your government can attack another one. And we can look at some of the things that are going on with natural gas for the Russians is a good example of that. And so then two, we have to look at our allies and our friends, and we don't want them, as with the whole question about Nord Stream 2 and other things, you don't want them to be in a position where they can be intimidated. So it's a good vector for sort of getting into and understanding foreign policy and how one particular thing can really have a much bigger impact in the overall scheme.
Yeah, thank you. And on a similar note, and moving on to your time as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Resources, I was wondering, what were some of the international issues or challenges that you encountered as Assistant Secretary for this bureau?
Well, I think a couple of things. One was, again, we'll come back to our basic concern was energy security. Mm-hmm. Ours, that of our allies and friends. A couple things in particular. I mean, obviously, we dealt with the questions of, were there supply shortages of oil, and was it driving up gasoline prices here in the pump, and what was that doing with the global economy, the American economy? That was one thing. But two particular things that I worked on, three particular things that I worked on, One was at this time, this was 2010 to 2014, was the rise of natural gas. Natural gas long ago was basically regarded as junk. You burned it off to get rid of it. Well, then we went, oops, this is actually a major fuel source. It burns cleaner than coal. It's now good looked at as a transition fuel to a greener future. So how do we develop that? How do we sort of create the international markets, the international systems to take advantage of this resource? That was one thing which we worked on. Another thing which we worked on was the question of countries coming into the energy patch and what's called the energy curse, or the natural resources curse. Because there are a number of countries which have developed oil, and with that has come terrible corruption, terrible misgovernment. And it's not inevitable. So one of the things which we worked on was with countries that were coming into the energy patch, which had new discoveries, was to find ways that they could develop that natural resource, but in a way that didn't necessarily lead to corruption. So that there was transparency, that there was good governance, that there was a sense of just, one of the things which I was involved with was the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And what that group does internationally, who's on the board, is sort of work with countries to have a commitment whereby the energy company or the mining company will say how much they pay country X and where that money goes in the government. The government of country X publishes what they receive and what they spend, so that the people in country X can actually see what's going on. And with the idea that with that transparency, with that ability to understand what's happening, you can say, oh, wait a minute, something's off here. And you can identify and you can fight the corruption. You can help create a system for better governance that's more efficient. It benefits the public. It benefits the country's development. Frankly, it also benefits the extractive industries companies, because then it's not a case of they're being accused of doing things that they're not doing. So the transparency is going around. So that was the second thing we worked on. The third thing which we worked on was particularly in the question of developing natural gas, but also working with governments so that they develop the resource soundly. Because, these oil and gas are, frankly, poisonous. You've got warning just on the gas tank. Okay, but there are lots of things like that that are dangerous, but you have to know how to manage them. And so what we worked with was bringing into expertise and making available U.S. expertise, private sector as well as government, to foreign companies, foreign governments, so that when they developed a resource, they could do it in a sound way. There was one country, for example, that had major oil, developing country, major oil discoveries in the middle of a national park. Okay, how do you handle this? There are ways of doing so. But if you do it wrong and you've got a bunch of crude oil lying on the ground, you've got an environmental mess. So those are the kinds of things we worked on. And again, it's kind of something that I think a lot of people would be surprised about, but we regarded this really as beneficial because, again, by helping other governments develop their resources soundly, that would improve energy security. And if one country is energy insecure, then it undermines the whole system, so it tears the whole web. So we all need to be in this together.
And are there any new challenges that you expect the US and the international community to face in relation to energy and energy resources?
Absolutely. No. Okay, first of all, environmental issues. Carbon. It's huge. And we're going to need to find, at the same time, while we've got to reduce our carbon footprint, so we have to reduce our carbon emissions, we also are in a situation that we continue to need energy and continue to need increasing amounts of energy internationally. Moreover, not just us, the US, but we can be looking at cutting our energy usage or cutting our carbon footprint. But there are other countries, China being a good example, India being another extremely important example, Middle East, Africa, where the need for energy is continuing to rise. How do those countries get it? and how do they at the same time sort of help pull back on carbon emissions? Because again, it's one planet and one atmosphere, and we're all in this together. The other thing is, something which we're working on is a redefinition, I think, of energy security, because a lot of times we talked about this just as access to oil and gas was sort of the shorthand in people's minds. Well, now you've got the climate question. You've got the social justice question of where is this developed? You know, what is this going through? How, you know, are you emitting things that are damaging to publics in particular countries? How do you address that? The connection between energy and IT is extremely important and growing. It's no longer the movies where you simply drilled a hole in the ground and the stuff came up, which it didn't really quite work like that then either, but it's not like that. I've been in the rooms, drilling operations of major oil companies, and it's guys sitting at computers because they're drilling down and then directional drilling. But then you also have the IT and AI coming into this in terms of not just production, but its use, on how refineries are working and how it's flowing. And it's not just the oil and gas, it's also electrical systems. And we've seen instances, we saw this here in the United States just recently with the Colonial Pipeline, where hackers were able to get in and disrupt the operation of that pipeline. We've seen examples in Ukraine where the Russians messed with the electrical grid. So, you know, what you can do online, you know, is a key factor here. Another thing are critical materials, because for production of batteries, lithium is a key thing. Rare earths are a key thing. Even copper right now is a commodity in short supply. Where do these commodities come from? How are they produced? How do we get access and assured access to them? This also comes into the energy security equation. So it's a broader situation. You think about this just in terms of our own military, where for years we looked at the Navy keeping open sea lanes, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Straits of Hormuz, the Straits of Malacca, where so much oil would flow through. Well, now we're going to have to also look at cybersecurity and how we defend that. So again, it's an evolving, frankly, very interesting thing. And all this has got to be going on at the same time that we're transforming from the hydrocarbon-based system to a more renewables, more sustainable-based system. So it's an interesting field.
Yeah, and I think a lot of students that are maybe interested in this field would find this conversation extremely interesting, and it's obviously a very important conversation to have now. And I think we have a few more minutes left, so I was hoping to move on to your time as ambassador to Azerbaijan. And just to start off, I was wondering, what were some of your more memorable experiences as ambassador?
I think the most interesting things were going out and meeting Azerbaijanis. Yeah, you expect you're going to be, meeting, senior officials, the president, you're going to be working with the government. But what I found was one of the things that was really important was to get out of the office. And sort of where we start, and I think it's hard because, again, coming back to the IT thing, so much of our communications now, MSc work, is frankly emails going back and forth. But you come back, you have to have a factual basis. You have to have knowledge of the country. And it was also, I think, important. Relations were sometimes difficult, but to be seen by Azerbaijanis, because they may never have actually met an American. And when you are the ambassador, you're the president's personal representative. That's what the job of an ambassador is. Your presence, you're going to a place, shows U.S. interest. And you're sitting down with people, shows U.S. interest. And so I think some of the things which I found most memorable were going out into the countryside in Azerbaijan with U.S. aid projects, meeting with people who had been displaced by the conflict with Armenia, and hearing their stories, finding out about them, finding out about their concerns, and then also trying to talk to them about the future. to sort of think, okay, how can the country move ahead? How can the United States work with them on moving ahead? And my wife very often would go with me on these trips. She, sometimes my kids, when they were in the country, would come along as well. But it was enjoyable. It was probably the most enjoyable part of the job. But I also thought it was probably the thing that, might be more remembered by people in the country. Because if you think about the number of speeches you've gone to, and you go, yeah, whatever, you don't remember a lot of times what somebody said. But you will remember their being there, and you remember some of the body language, you remember some of the interaction. And that, I thought, was really valuable, and frankly, what I enjoyed, and I hope had a beneficial impact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, and I think for our last question, I was hoping to give some advice to students based on your career expertise, and just based on your position, both as ambassador, but also your senior diplomatic positions as well. Did you learn any leadership lessons or advice that you would think would be important to relay over to students who are looking to follow in similar footsteps as yours?
I think in terms of leadership, this is something I always feel the state. When I had time at the National War College, I was really impressed with how the military developed their officers. Something which we probably need to do more of in the State Department. But I think a couple things. One thing which I've sort of realized in retrospect, I never studied psychology and wish I had. At least one psych course in there somewhere. Another thing is, in terms of advice, people will often ask, what should I study to get into the State Department? And there's really, I think, two criteria to be in the U.S. Foreign Service. One, being a U.S. citizen. Two, being between the ages of 21 and 65. So that kind of covers a lot of territory.
Right.
And is there a, okay, I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, sort of, quote, the classical, thing. But two courses, which I found over the course of my career, were probably some of the most provided some of the most valuable help to me, were ones that were completely extraneous to my Foreign Service, my SFS curriculum, AP Biology and Geology.
Mm.
And which I took Geology my senior year because I was like, I'm kind of interested, senior year, second semester, if not, no, when are you ever going to do this? And I got into it, and it was very helpful for me, ironically, later on when I got into the energy side of things, because it gave me an understanding of basic understanding of what people were talking about. At a point too, I was special negotiator for biotechnology. And that biology knowledge, which I had gotten years ago, senior year in high school, suddenly turned out to be useful. So I sort of joke, you never know when there's going to be a test. Mm-hmm. Things that you're studying that you may think are completely extraneous may turn out to be useful later on. Mm-hmm. And to just be open to that. The other thing I think is just being open to new experiences. The greatest thing about the Foreign Service is being in a position to be something that other Americans can't do, and other Americans aren't physically able to be doing it at that moment. They could maybe if they were in there, but they're not there. So it's dealing with that particular situation with a police officer in South Africa, or a tribesman in Yemen, or a banker in Tokyo. You're there, and you're going to learn from it, and you're going to build up your own sort of tool chest. And so, the State Department should be a place for lifelong. We should recognize it's a place for lifelong learning. That you're going to be doing things. You're going to be picking up experiences the whole way through. Things to do and things. Oh boy, I wish I had not done that. But constantly being open to those new experiences, and also encouraging, I think this is the leadership thing, encouraging those around you to be open to that. I think in some ways people will think diplomacy is hidebound. There's some, read a diplomatic note. It is the most archaic language you can possibly come up with. But It's what's behind it
Yeah.
that's important. So it's sometimes, you're using these old systems, but to deal with today's problems and problems that are on the horizon. So it's being open, I think, to those new experiences and welcoming them, and hopefully having somebody that you can share them with and be able to say, that was really good, or boy, was that weird. Either way.
Well, thank you so much again, Ambassador Cekuta, for taking the time to interview with us today. We really appreciate all of your insight and just for taking the time this morning to have this conversation with us, especially for the students that are watching who are interested in joining the State Department or the Foreign Service.
Really appreciate that. And I think it is a great career. I would really recommend it. And I'd also say to people, not just the Foreign Service, there are lots of ways to do international work these days. And if you're not in the State Department, well, then there are lots of other ways you can do it. So be creative and be open to it. The world's a great place.